Los Angeles, 1947. A city glittering with ambition and hiding something rotten beneath its glamour. A woman is found in a vacant lot. Not dumped, not tossed away. Staged. Like a porcelain mannequin cracked in half. Mouth carved into a gruesome smile. Limbs positioned just so, and drained of every drop of blood. She was beautiful. She was brutalized. She became a legend. This is the story of Elizabeth Short, better known as the Black Dahlia. Welcome to Glow in the Dark, where beauty meets the bizarre, and self-care gets a little sinister. I'm Destiny, mom to two girls who already know that the real monsters? Yeah, they're not the ones in the movies. They're the ones hiding in plain sight. And if I'm being honest, they're probably outside my door right now, listening to me dive deep into these cases with you. I'm also a permanent makeup artist, and now, your haunted host through the shadows. I've always been drawn to the darker stuff. True crime, unsolved mysteries, anything that doesn't quite fit where it should. Yeah, that's usually where you'll find me. So, before we dig in, a quick heads up. This podcast covers disturbing crimes and graphic details. Listener discretion is advised. But you know what? You know what keeps me coming back to these cases? And what has me diving deep into the new ones? It isn't just the gore. It's the why. What makes a killer? What thoughts haunt them? How does trauma shape a monster? Is it nature or is it nurture? Are people born this way or are they broken into it? I want to know how they think, why they did it, what flipped that switch. Are we looking at the McDonald triad? Animal cruelty, fire setting, bedwetting? Is it psychopathy, narcissism, or childhood trauma? Or maybe it's something else entirely. Because monsters don't just appear out of nowhere. They're made. And sometimes, we help make them. We're not just here to recount horror. We're here to peel back the layers, to explore what drives people into the shadows, and maybe, just maybe, find a little meaning there. Each week, we dive into these cases together. The chilling, the paranormal, the strange, with a little glam and a little ritual to ground you on the way out. So if you're into true crime and all the twisted roots that grow beneath it, let's glow through these shadows together. Because even in the darkest stories, there's beauty to uncover. Okay, so before we dive deep into this, let me just say, you are going to hear me mispronounce so many things. There's going to be random words that seem so easy, but you can guarantee that I am going to mess them up. It's like I can barely speak English. I can trip over flat surfaces. I can misspell things. I just blah, blah, blah. You know? These words are going to be butchered at times, and I am so sorry for that. Don't come for me in the comments, please, and don't give up on me just yet. Because I promise this podcast is going to be good. Okay, I know we've all heard the name, the Black Dahlia. It's one of those cases, right? The name alone feels iconic. But the thing that gets me is that almost nobody remembers her real name. She was Elizabeth Short. And somehow that part, the part that she was a real girl, gets lost under the headlines, under the myths, under the theories. Really under the circus of the whole thing, because the press ran so wild. They named her, they framed her, they practically made a brand out of her murder. And the LAPD? Let's just say that the chain of custody was so sloppy, it's almost like they wanted the evidence to disappear. So yeah, maybe you've heard the story before. Maybe you've got your own theory. But I've dug deep into this case, and I'm inviting you to look at it again, but this time with me. Maybe there's something you missed. Maybe we'll find a new angle. Maybe we'll finally get closer to the truth behind the legend. Elizabeth was 22, a dreamer, an aspiring actress from Massachusetts. She came to Los Angeles chasing stardust like so many others, but she vanished into its shadows. She was born on July 29, 1924 in Hyde Park, but raised in Medford, one of 5 daughters brought up by her mother, Phoebe, after a betrayal that would haunt them for life. During the Great Depression, her father, Cleo Short, lost everything. His business, his savings, his pride. So he left his car on the Charleston Bridge and vanished. Authorities thought he jumped, and so did Phoebe. But 12 years later, a letter arrived. Cleo was alive, living in California, and just like that, the man who faked his own death wanted back in. Okay, let's just pause there for a minute because this man really tried to fake his own death and then wrote a letter 12 years later just thinking that everything would be okay? The audacity! The audacity. I cannot get over that. That part just has me absolutely stunned. I know if my father did anything like that and vanished for 12 years after I thought he committed suicide, there is no way in hell, sorry, probably not allowed to say that, there is no way that I would just be okay with it and accept him back. Like, sir, you left. You left for 5 years. So props to Phoebe for raising those 5 girls and probably working countless hours just to take care of them, just to provide food for them every day. I mean, she was probably living day by day because this is the Great Depression we're talking about. Times were hard, and she had to do it alone while grieving. You can only imagine the trauma that did to that entire family. Elizabeth moved to Vallejo to live with her father, hoping maybe, finally she'd find a sense of home. But the reunion was rocky. They argued and it turned cold, so eventually she moved out. And once again, she was on her own. But here's the thing. Elizabeth didn't drift because she was reckless. She drifted because she never got to feel rooted. She floated through the city like a ghost in heels, using fake names and sleeping on borrowed couches, and writing sad poetic letters on a cheap stationery. She worked where she could, hostessing, waitressing, taking odd jobs, just trying to hold her own. She had raven curls and porcelain skin and lips that could stop a room. People described her as dramatic, mysterious, and magnetic. She loved black dresses. She even dyed her shoes to match. She wore red lipstick like armor. She built herself a look, dark, striking, and soft, like she knew that her image was the one thing that she could control. Despite what the tabloids screamed later, there's 0 evidence she ever did sex work. But that didn't stop the press from painting her that way. Because a pretty girl with secrets is always easier to sell when you twist the narrative. Some say she was manipulative. Others said she was just trying to survive in a town built on illusion. And really, who hasn't worn a little illusion just to get through the day? And just before her death, she may have been trying to escape LA entirely. There were whispers that she wanted to travel north to visit her sister. As if she knew, as if she felt it in her bones that something was coming. But she didn't know that the story that would make her famous would be the one written in blood. January 15th, 1947. A woman named Betty Berzinger was walking with her daughter through Lemire Park when she saw something strange in a vacant lot. Still, white, lying in 2 halves. She thought it was a mannequin, but as she got closer, she realized it wasn't plastic. It was flesh. Elizabeth Short's body had been cut clean in half between the 2nd and 3rd lumbar vertebrae, a precise medical procedure called a hemicorporectomy. Her body was drained of blood and scrubbed meticulously. She was posed with her arms above her head and legs spread. Her face was mutilated, carved from ear to ear in what we now call a Glasgow smile. Her intestines were tucked beneath her lower back. There was no blood at the scene, no drag marks, and no sign of struggle. Near her body, a 50-pound cement sack, stained and folded, likely used to transport her there. She wasn't dumped there. She was delivered. This wasn't just a murder. This was theater. Can you imagine being Betty? Just think about it for a minute. It's a quiet morning. You're just walking your 3-year-old toddler, and then all of a sudden you see a mannequin. But honestly, I can see why she thought it was a mannequin. Your brain is naturally wired to save you. It doesn't want you to see something traumatic. I don't know about you, but my brain always expects the worst. We expect the worst, and I say we because, we're crazy in here, but we expect the worst. So that way, when something bad happens, we're not let down. But Betty clearly doesn't think that way. She thought it was a mannequin. But could you imagine? You're with your 3-year-old. A, how do you get out of that situation? B, how do you not traumatize your kid in a situation like that? I mean, the woman is cut clean in half and carved from ear to ear in a Glasgow smile. That's gonna leave some kind of damage. I don't care how old you are. But I mean, the authorities still have to be called. Someone has to be notified. But what do you do with your child? I mean, as a mother, what would you do? I would have mine turn around. But it's a different time. The crime was horrifying. There's no other way to put that. But what the press did next, that was unforgivable. They called Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe Short, back in Massachusetts and told her that Elizabeth won a beauty contest. And naturally, Phoebe was thrilled. For one fleeting moment, her daughter was alive and famous and making it. And then they dropped the truth. She was dead, murdered and mutilated. But why lie? Because they wanted something raw, something quotable, something they could print in bold. If sarcasm could kill, half the 1947 newsroom would have dropped on the spot. But what makes me sick is that they weren't even finished with Phoebe. They weren't ready to let her grieve. They flew Phoebe to Los Angeles under the guise of helping her get answers, giving her hope that someone cared. But no, they just wanted the exclusive, before anyone else could even ask her how she felt about her daughter being butchered. Because nothing screams journalistic integrity like emotional manipulation with a boarding pass. They printed rumors, fake confessions, and headlines that bled with innuendo. Party girl's fatal flirtation, police seeking pervert slayer of a pretty girl. They weren't reporting a tragedy. They were selling a fantasy. A seductive, scandalous story wrapped in blood and lipstick. Because once you rewrite a woman as a temptress, she's easier to exploit. But they didn't stop at grief. They rewrote her, not as a daughter, not as a victim, but as a warning. The headlines fixated on her black dresses, her dyed shoes, and her beauty. Her looks became the crime scene. They turned her into too pretty, too mysterious, too available. They couldn't find her killer, but they sure knew how to slut-shame her from every angle. They called her the Black Dahlia so often that people forgot that she had a real name. She stopped being Elizabeth. She became a myth, a ghost, a cautionary tale carved into Hollywood's pavement, a tragedy buried under lipstick and lies. Everyone wanted a piece of the Dahlia. The LAPD started rounding up suspects, ex-boyfriends, bartenders, neighbors, even a bellhop who said she smiled at him once. Every theory became a headline, and every headline became a new suspect. At this point, the LAPD wasn't solving a murder. They were casting a noir film called Who Looked the Most Suspicious This Week? Because over 150 people were questioned. Over 50 people confessed, but none of them was creditable. Some just wanted attention. Others liked the idea of being linked to a legend. Investigators even chased one man across 8 states. 8 states, only to find out he had never even been in California. And the press? They were right there, front row, feeding the fire, leaking crime scene photos and printing rumors like gospel. Because nothing says respect for the dead like tripping over case files to get a better camera angle, right? Now, let's talk about the investigation, if you can even call it that. Because what happened next wasn't just sloppy, it was a disaster. The crime scene was compromised from the start. Tire tracks? Trampled. Footprints? Contaminated. People wandered through the lot before it was even taped off. Reporters literally stood where her body had been found. And even the positioning of her body? Disputed by the very first officers on the scene. Some said her arms were above her head, others said they weren't. This wasn't a crime scene. It was a stage, and they let the memory of it get messy. There were no drag marks, no blood. She had been killed somewhere else, drained, washed, delivered, and then posed. The bloody heel print in the grass was noted, but never matched to anyone. And the LAPD? They didn't even search for a secondary dump site. They lost evidence, filed reports late, and contradicted each other nonstop. They let their biggest lead rot. And then came the autopsy. Elizabeth had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, a fracture on the right side of her skull. She likely lost consciousness before anything else was done to her. There were ligature marks on her wrist, ankles, and neck, clear signs of restraint. She had been tied down, controlled. There were burns on her breast, cigarette burns, inflicted after death. There were deliberate, clean incisions along her breast, thighs, and pubic area. Not random, not chaotic. They were patterned. And then comes the part that still stuns forensic experts today. She had been severed in half, cleanly and precisely, right between the second and third lumbar vertebrae. That's a hemicorporectomy. Like I mentioned earlier, that's a rare surgical procedure typically done in a hospital trauma setting. It requires anatomical knowledge, steady hands, and surgical training. You don't just figure that out on the fly. You study for that. You practice and you plan. You don't just drain a body of blood, scrub it clean, and stage it like a gallery piece unless you've done this before. This wasn't rage. It was choreography. Like every cut was part of a performance. One suspect still stands out, even all these decades later. And I have to say, he's at the top of my list. Really, he's the only one on my list. Dr. George Hodel. He was wealthy, well-connected, and creepy as hell. He wasn't just a physician. He was a surrealist with a god complex, a man whose charm ran just deep enough to cover something foul. He lived in the Soden House, a Hollywood mansion built like a Mayan temple, and inside, there were hidden rooms, a dark room, even whispers of underground tunnels. The kind of place that doesn't need ghosts, because the walls are already watching. So, what makes Hodel the prime suspect? Have you thought about it? I'm sure you've heard about him, especially if you're here. He was a trained surgeon. He lived minutes from where Elizabeth's body was found. He was investigated for incest with his own daughter, and he was also linked to several illegal underground abortions that just happened to vanish from record. And the LAPD? They bugged his house for 40 days. And what they caught him saying? Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary because she's dead. That's not a confession. That's arrogance soaked in privilege and untouchability. And maybe he was right, because George Hodel was never arrested and never charged. He fled the country not long after those wiretaps. He lived in the Philippines for decades and died in 1999, free. But his own son, Steve Hodel, a former LAPD homicide detective, spent the rest of his life building a case against his own father. He found handwriting that matched the taunting letters sent to the police. a cement sack in the Soden House crawl space, just like the one found at the dump site, and photos of a woman who looked eerily like Elizabeth tucked away in Hodell's personal collection. This wasn't a conspiracy theory. This was a breadcrumb trail in plain sight. And the LAPD? They closed the file, redacted the transcripts, and let the trail rot. Could you imagine growing up in the Soden house like Steve? You obviously know that your father is a monster because he's under investigation for incest with your sister. But your father is almost untouchable. He's wealthy and well-connected. He has these giant parties where women come in, but possibly never leave. The things that Steve may have saw, found, or even heard, especially in the hidden rooms in that house, maybe that's what drove him to be a homicide detective. Maybe that's what drove him to spend the rest of his life building a case against his father. Maybe. Who knows, right? Now, let's step out of the spotlight and into the psyche. Because in 1947, criminal profiling wasn't even a thing. There were no databases, no behavioral units, just a city spiraling, and one man willing to stare into the abyss. Dr. J. Paul DeRiver, part psychologist, part noir philosopher, part twisted narrator who didn't blink an eye at the grotesque. But what made DeRiver stand out and piss people off wasn't just his analysis, it was how he coldly delivered it. Imagine sitting across from a man who describes human dismemberment like he's critiquing a painting. He didn't flinch at Gore. He saw patterns, intent. He believed that mutilation wasn't chaos, it was choreography. To DeRiver, the killer didn't want to destroy Elizabeth. He wanted to control her narrative, even in death. He later wrote a book called The Sexual Criminal, where he profiled rapists, pedophiles, and sadists. He used real case photos. It was banned for being too graphic and too fascinated with the darkness. So yeah, controversial doesn't begin to cover it. But whether you like him or not, Dr. J. Paul DeRiver saw something the public didn't want to admit. This wasn't just about Elizabeth. It was about power, projection, and how a city like Los Angeles can create and hide a very specific kind of monster. His quote, "This was a man with a compulsion, not just to kill, but to display. Elizabeth's body was posed like a gallery piece. The killer wanted her seen, not just destroyed, transformed. This was ritual. He wasn't hiding her body. He was making art." Sadly, over time, Elizabeth's face became a Halloween mask, a noir muse, a meme, and even a trend. People forgot she had a real name, a real story. She was a girl who had asthma and loved the ocean. She wrote sad poems and survived heartbreak. She wanted to be seen, but not like this. She didn't die because she was dangerous. She died because someone decided she was disposable. And the world? They turned her into a brand instead of giving her justice. Okay, so do you guys remember whenever I told you that Steve Hodell, George's son, wrote a book? Oh God, I hope you do, because if you don't, that means I'm very boring. Anyways, Steve wrote a book called The Black Dahlia The Black Dahlia Avenger. Obviously, I can't speak. Anyways, Steve wrote a book, The Black Dahlia Avenger. I mentioned it previously. But what I didn't tell you then, I'm going to tell you now. Are you ready? Okay. He wrote a book, and it wasn't just a memoir. It was a match that couldn't be extinguished. Now, it did take some years, for the ball to get going, but it did. Because once it hit the shelves, it couldn't be ignored. People had to investigate it. In 2012, investigators returned to the source, the Soden House, that cold concrete temple George Hodell once called a home, a place with geometry too sharp and shadows too still. But they weren't just chasing ghosts. They brought in Buster, a cadaver dog trained to detect human decomposition even long after the bodies are gone. And Buster? Yeah, he didn't hesitate. The first alert was in the basement. The second was in the backyard soil. And the third was in the northeast corner of the property. 3 separate locations. 3 places where something, or should I say someone, may have decomposed quietly and visibly beneath the glamour. Soil from each site was sent to forensic anthropologist Dr. Apad Voss, who tested for VOCs, volatile organic compounds. Okay, so if you don't know what the VOCs are, the volatile organic compounds, that is basically the chemical language of death. Pretty nifty that this doctor is trained to find that. I don't know. I find that intriguing. I don't know about you. But it's gases released by decomposing. I almost said that wrong. Decomposing, Destiny. Say it with me. Decomposing. So it's gases released by decomposing human remains. Things like cadaverine and putrescine. Nifty though, right? There's a chemical language of death. You don't see it, but it lingers. And the results of those tests? All 3 samples were positive. There were no bodies. There were no bones. Just the trace of death soaked into the foundation, as if the house fed on it, as if those women who entered never really left. And if Buster was right, if those alerts are what they seem, then Elizabeth may not have been George's only victim. She may have just been the only one with a nickname. 3 alerts, 1 surgeon, and no justice. Just the murmur of a basement, the breath of a garden, and the silence of a northeast corner. Good boy, Buster. You may have been the only one who ever found them. Okay, so everyone processes stories like this differently. I've talked to family, co-workers, and even the very few friends I have about the paranormal, the unexplained, and true crime. And when I go into detail, I realize everyone is processing it differently. They're not all like me. So this is why I made this next segment. Because for some, if you're like me, you can binge it for hours. You can just go on and on and on and on like an endless rabbit hole. But for others, it could bring up something that you've lived through or something that you genuinely fear. So if your heart's racing or you're feeling a little off, that's okay. Because the next part is for you, and it's going to be at the end of every episode going forward. Because no matter how dark the story gets, we always come back to the light. So let's wind down together. Tonight's ritual is about reclamation, a glam ritual, but also a shield. Light a candle, black or crimson. Cleanse your face, not to erase, but to reveal. Moisturize with intention, and take your sharpest eyeliner, the one that feels like armor, and draw a wing like a dagger. And finish with a lipstick that lingers, a deep plum or a dahlia black. And then look in the mirror and say her name, Elizabeth. And then say, my beauty is mine. My story is not yours to write. I glow in the dark. Tonight, you took her name back. Thank you for walking in the dark with me tonight. If this story moved you, haunted you, or lit a fire in your chest, subscribe and leave a review below. And if you want to find me on social media, you can find me on Instagram at Glow in the Dark Podcast and on Facebook, Glow in the Dark, Beauty, Crime, and the Unknown. Feel free to tag me, share, message, whatever it may be. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear what you think of the podcast because we're just getting started. And next time, we're heading somewhere even stranger. A haunted elevator, a girl who vanished on camera, a hotel with more ghosts than guests. Can you guess? Until then, stay radiant, even in the dark.